Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the second webinar on our the series of webinars that we are conducting on China's global outreach. Specifically, the aim of this webinar is to know about China's three global initiatives: the Security Initiative, the Development Initiative, and the Civilization Initiative. And today's webinar is targeted to discuss African perspective. And for that, we have a guest from Africa, Dr. Bright. Dr. Bright is faculty at Echo Technical University. He is lecturer in Social Sciences Department. It's my pleasure to have you with us, Dr. Bright.
Thank you very, very much, Dr. Asif. Always good to talk with you.
Thank you. So let's kickstart our today's conversation with my first question. As I've talked about in my introduction about China's three global initiatives. So my first question is, how do you look at China's overall, global ambitions? We have witnessed, especially when, fortunately, you and me, we happened to be in China when China was, touching all these glories and China was doing all these projects. And we have witnessed this, these ambitions and China's outreach, the policy making. We've been participating in many seminars there. So how do you look at China's global ambitions in a historical perspective and in the contemporary perspective? And specifically, please enlighten us African perspective about China's ambitions.
All right, thank you so much. And I'm very happy to join today's conference. I think it's very important that as intellectuals, as people in academia, we need to constantly engage in these kinds of conversations, especially regarding China and its role in the world, for a number of reasons. First of all, China is an emerging power. It's one of those great powers now. And its role is going to be, profound as we go by. So definitely we need to understand what China is doing and how we as, developing countries can also fit into China's narrative and China's ambitions and generally the whole global political environment. So it's important for us to constantly remind ourselves and also understand what is happening is not only as faculty, but also as students and people who are following international relations and all that. So it's important that we engage in this conversation. China has always been very significant in the politics or in the international relation of African states, especially in recent times. Because as you may know, most African countries now deal with China in trade terms. It's one of our biggest trading partners. And in terms of political arrangement as well, China has become increasingly important in the way we, deal with the rest of the world for a number of reasons. So how do we as African people see China's outlook? I think in order to understand and appreciate China's role, we need to contextualize the experience of Africa. Africa, like many regions of the world, we have experienced so many years of colonization from these Western countries. We have experienced a lot of brutalities and treatment from the Western countries, which in fact, even though colonization, all those things ended, still there are vestiges of those things prevalent even today. So China is seen in the light of many African countries as a significant other, like a different kind of power that is emerging, which potentially could be good for us. Despite the fact that we consider it this way, we are also very careful because we do not intend to make the mistakes that we made with the Western countries, especially with the UK, France, and Germany and other countries that prior to Chinese engagement have been dealing with us for years. So we are extremely cautious and careful in how we consider China or how we see China's influence in Africa. And we are mindful of the fact that there is a big possibility that China could replicate the same mistakes or the same mistakes that these Western countries made in Africa. So we are mindful of all those things, and yet we are also strategically, careful in dealing with them and embracing them in order to benefit from the positive sides that they bring to us. And so when China introduced this Belt and Road Initiative, the BNRI, I think the two of us, we have had extensive engagement with some of these things in China.
Yeah.
We appear to kind of embrace it generally. I think Pakistan also is one of those partners to China as far as this Belt and Road Initiative is concerned. And so we are open to China's engagement. We are carefully observing how China is navigating this global international political arena, and also, mindful of how we as actors or, agents can also benefit from some of these things and limit the consequences that may come out of it. So I think that the question is general outlook, of how we see China's rise or how we see China's engagement in the international political arena. I think it's more of strategic carefulness, if I should put it that way, that we are careful not to totally embrace for us to repeat the same mistakes that we made with the Western countries. But at the same time, we are giving China a lot of the benefit of the doubt in order to engage with them more, to see how we can mutually benefit as people.
Nice. Thank you so much. Fascinating. You've beautifully encapsulated China's ambitions. Well, if you look at China's engagement with Africa, we know that China has been there since 1960s. And in recent years, especially after the Belt and Road Initiative, we've seen China has invested immensely. Even African Union's headquarters was built by China. A lot of infrastructure projects, a rail project in Kenya, parliament buildings in many African countries. So we have seen that Africa has some sort become indispensable for China in terms of African markets, investment, and at the same time, political clout in United Nations, you may say, right? So African region has been a very important region for China. However, China is, engaging with other regions as well. So what do you think is the most important region for China in the contemporary politics? We've seen that China mediated, agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia. China is increasing its, presence in the Middle East. China is engaged with Pakistan and South Asia. China is looking towards Central Asia as well. Even economically, it has engaged with Europe. So, in your opinion, which region holds more significance for China in the contemporary politics?
That's a very important question as well, because in order to understand China, we need to know what China needs and which part of the regions can provide some of those needs to China. So I would analyze it in terms of what China needs and which region of the world can provide some of those needs. Because China's needs are diverse. It could be political, it could be economic, it could be in terms of the need for raw materials. It could also be diplomatic. And so segregating or, dissecting some of these needs would help us to appreciate better which region some of these needs to China. So if you look at in terms of raw materials, I would say Africa has important significance to China, because Africa is a continent that is replete with a lot of raw materials and natural resources.
Yes.
So when it comes to petroleum products and other mineral resources, a lot of it is in Africa. And in fact, there are global estimates that more than 40% of the whole global reserves of natural resources are in Africa. So China cannot do without Africa in terms of need for raw materials, natural resources, petroleum products, and all that. And it is in the same way that Central Asia is important to China, because Central Asia, the Middle East as well, they are places that have a lot of, huge deposits of petroleum products that China would need. In addition to the raw materials, China will also need those places as markets to sell the produce that they produce or whatever they produce in the countries. So these are essential places for China. But in terms of China's security, I would say that the near abroad of China, or the countries that are within the neighborhood of China, they are very important for China. So I would also include the ASEAN countries, the Central Asian countries, India, I mean, Pakistan, all the countries in the near abroad of China. They hold significant importance to China because anybody that controls some of those countries significantly also can affect China in terms of security significantly. So these also hold significant importance to China. And that is why I think China is engaged in this kind of the South China Sea, issue with other countries over there in order to protect its near abroad in safeguarding its security. Diplomatically also, I think that China needs both Africa, Central Asia, and even Latin America, because though the economies of those places may not be so big, but they have the numbers in terms of voting in the UN Security Council, I mean, the General Assembly as well. I mean, most importantly, the General Assembly. So the Chinese would need some of these numbers in order to push through some of their ideas that they want to push onto the world. And so in terms of diplomatic reasons, I would say that most countries in Africa, South America, and Asia, that's where the numbers are. So China will need these countries as well in order to push its security needs forward. In all, China would need most countries in the world because as it grows and develops, its security needs will be, stretched beyond its neighborhood into Africa because investment of China will be posted in Africa as well. And then also in the South America, Chinese investment will be moving to those places. So as the investments are there probably would also be the need to push some of these security, abilities to those places. And I'm suspecting that that is probably the reason why they are beginning to introduce some of this new, concept that the GSI, the Global Security Initiative, and all that. Because initially, you remember very well when we were in China, we used to, hear all these narratives of China is not interested in, or just, consolidating the domestic politics and all that. And gradually the narrative is changing, now we're talking about global security initiative. The global connotes something that is more than within China. Even though the interpretation that we are putting to it is still within domestic politics, but I'm sure that as time goes by, all this domestic interpretation will extend to cover other countries in other parts of the world. So the needs of China depends or determines which countries or regions are important to China. I would say for now, the key ones will be Africa, Central Asia, ASEAN, and probably also Latin America. They would need to actually work together with China for China to realize its economic interests in order to feed its population, in order to expand its markets, in order to source for raw materials, and also be independent of Western sanctions. They will need some of these, countries to help them out. For example, even in the manufacture of some complex, machines, maybe iPhones or laptops or almost everything, they will need some components which they can source from Africa. They will need some components which they can source from other regions of the world. And all these places are important for China. So they will need to deal with them very carefully, strategically, so they don't lose them in their engagement with them. Yeah.
I couldn't agree more. I couldn't agree more. You absolutely point on. I would like to add here, definitely, as China is growing, China is aspiring to be a great power or superpower. China definitely needs, raw material from Africa, right? And then it also needs a political clout. And one more thing that is, changing, and we are seeing a new China. That is, has come out as a great power who is providing security guarantees. We have seen especially in terms of the agreement that has happened between Saudi Arabia and Iran. It is the first time China has, become more pragmatic and has become a, a player who historically believed in non-interference policy in other countries' domestic
Exactly.
policies. But here, because China's stakes are high, because the energy resources are in the Middle East, and China definitely needs to secure that. And do you think, my question is that, do you think China, the new China that we are seeing, the new policies that we are seeing under Xi Jinping, that China is becoming a great power that is giving security guarantees to other countries as well, where it has more, more important resources, or you may say, which are politically
To a
significant?
very large extent, I can say that as well. However, there is a caveat. I think China is in a very difficult situation as we speak, because the initial foreign policy, practice is to remain, uninterested in what happens in other countries. And that has always been what they have been professing. We're not interested in interventionism. We don't care about we just care about our country. We want to just survive and develop as a country. But like you said, the deal that they have brokered between Iran and Saudi Arabia is a significant thing, because all those countries that are suffering because of the tension between Iran and Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Syria, they are backing different factions in the conflict in those places. At least the guns can be silenced to some degree, or there is a possibility of peace prevailing in some of those places because of China. And I think this is a very significant step. As China begins to succeed in some of these things, there will be a growing appetite to escalate some of those interventions or some of those engagements with other countries in terms of brokering peace and security in all those places. So definitely China is gradually departing from the traditional foreign policy, which is to remain within its borders. And as time goes by, this will definitely increase. You begin to see China, becoming more assertive or more, interested in protecting either allies or, proxies or investment or whatever in different parts of the region. And that is something they cannot do. They cannot do without, because as a growing power, you will definitely need to engage your power or to, extend your power in order to protect your investment and your asset and probably your friends as well. But I think right now they are not pushing that as a full foreign policy objective. They are just being careful, tactical in trying to do that. So, for example, there is a conflict in Ukraine. Everybody thinks that China would, in case of an escalation, China would go in defense of Russia. But the Chinese are very strategic about that. They're not openly saying that. They are not saying that we can engage with you in terms of trade, but if you are fighting, you're on your own. I mean, it's kind of strategic ambiguity in a way. And I think it is, in a way, trying to be very smart about navigating the whole complex web of international relations and, great power politics. So that's how I see it. I think that gradually they'll get there, but for now, they're being smart and strategic about it. They will support maybe countries in Africa, and yet if there are serious problems, they will still, appear to be non-interested or like, yeah, something like that. So it's more or less kind of unclear, but we can all see the trend that gradually it will lead to something more assertive.
Yeah, absolutely. You talked about great power politics, and China is playing smartly the great game of great power politics. I would say that China is playing this game with Chinese characteristics, the word we used to use always.
Exactly, I agree with you.
You've explained it, fascinating. So my next question is more sensitive, and it's more about the regions, it concerns, Chinese investments in these developing countries. We've seen that China has engaged with African countries and it has invested billions and billions of dollars. There are estimates almost $300 billion China has invested in Africa. And many of African nations owe debt to China. Let's say, for example, Kenya's 72% of its total debt is owed to China. And the Western scholars have talked about the debt trap diplomacy of China. And we've seen the example of this debt trap diplomacy in terms of Sri Lanka when the Hambantota seaport was given to China on 99 years lease. So my question here is the Chinese investment that is coming into developing countries under these initiatives and Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think it's some sort of a debt trap for these developing countries? And is it going to bite back China, or is it going to be something that will lead to, as in Pakistan, there are criticisms here that Pakistan would become East India Company of China. So that is my question. That what is the concerns of these developing countries, and how do you look at the debt that is being piling up on these developing countries?
To be honest, this is a growing discussion that most scholars on the African continent continue to have about whether or not China is entrapping the continent in debt, and whether the kind of loans and the debt that we get from China is something that is going to strangle us going forward, or is something that is beneficial to us. To be very fair to China in this particular situation, it is also important to know that despite the fact that so many countries in Africa are indebted to China, and yet you'll be surprised to know that most African countries are even more indebted to international organizations, these multilateral organizations like the IMF, the World Bank. And yet, because it is not a country, we tend to forget about that and focus more on China.
Absolutely.
So, yeah. So if you look at it from that perspective, because these Western countries control these Bretton Woods institutions, so if you look at it from that perspective, they are even bigger creditors to Africa than China is. And Africa is indebted to them more than China. Okay. And yet you also see a lot of them, shouting on top of their roofs that China is strangling Africa, engaging in debt, diplomacy, or this kind of debt trap diplomacy and all that. As an African, I think there's a reason for us to be worried, because too much debt that you cannot pay is not something that you can encourage. And I don't think that it is important, or it is a good idea for African countries to continue to contract loans when they know they are not going to be in a position to pay them back. So I think that it is something that African countries need to consider very well, and then make sure that they don't engage in loans that they are not able to pay. And even if they contract loans from China, the terms and the conditions of the loan must be clear, and must be in a way that China will not have the right to seize assets, as you indicate happened in Sri Lanka. And there are reports also that it happened close to, Zambia also, and things like that. So China will not have that kind of leverage to come and seize and say, oh, your airport is for me now because you failed to pay your debt. Your harbor or your ports are for me now because you cannot pay your debt and all that. These kind of clauses must be looked at before African countries engage in them. Having said that also, I think that the issue of China engaging in debt trap diplomacy is probably oversimplifying the relationship between China and Africa, because there are so many countries that are also engaging with China, and they are getting loans that they're using for good purposes. And they are not, just swallowing anything that China throws in front of them. There are some countries that are very careful, and the loans that they are contracting from China are being, put to good use. And I think there are only dotted cases of some countries that are engaged in this kind of debt trap situation. Maybe you can talk about the Zambia as we see. But a lot of the countries are preferring the Chinese loans to the Western, loans, because the Chinese loans do not have like conditionalities or conditions attached to them. African countries now decide what their development needs are. They go for loans from China and execute some of these development needs. The Western countries, on the other hand, they'll give you the loans, they'll tell you what to use the monies for, and when it doesn't bring development, they'll blame you for not doing it well. So at the end of the day, it's more or less like two options available. And if you look at what China offers and what Western countries or these kind of multilateral institutions offer, the Chinese loans are much better. The Chinese loans are much, much better. And it's also important for for us to also put into this discussion the fact that when China realizes that some African countries are not able to pay their monies back, they don't just jump into seizing assets. As we speak, there have been restructuring of loans where if China realizes that some African countries are not able to pay, they renegotiate the conditions of payment, where the repayment are stretched over a long period of time so that the African countries are in a position to pay back. So it is not just completely true that China is engaged in debt trap diplomacy, even though as Africans, we are careful, or we are careful of the possibility of that happening. And so we have to analyze all this, significant development in context and realize that, well, China may also be pursuing its own interests. However, if you compare the Chinese debt situation and the Western interests, the debt coming from the Western countries, you realize that the Chinese ones are much better. They are preferable. And it is something that is inconveniencing the Western countries. And that is why they are always even shouting more than they bereaved. It's like they are crying more than they bereaved. That's how I see it. Yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. Excellent analysis, I would say that. So my next question is more about the contemporary situation of international politics right now. We've seen that the Ukrainian conflict is ongoing, and now in Gaza, situation is worsening day by day. And it's more about the overall security of our international politics and international system, you may say. So under China's global security initiative, what pragmatic role China can play? We've seen that China is now showing its wings, that China can be a security guarantor, or we've seen a shift in Chinese foreign policy. So under Chinese global security initiative, what do you think its pragmatic role could be?
Very important. If you look at the outlook of the global international scene, it's not good, I can tell you, because a lot of things are happening. It doesn't look very positive at all. In Russia, Ukraine, right now, nobody even discusses what is happening. I think the bombing is still ongoing, and yet it is completely absent in the international news reportage. Now, our new, situation is the Israel-Gaza conflict. And I think if we continue to create multiples of that situation where one conflict is forgotten about, then we just move. It's like we are actually poisoning the atmosphere for coexistence in the international system. And I think China has a significant role over here with this proposition of this global security initiative. I think that China can also, in terms of providing security guarantee, I think it helps in a way. So for example, with this issue of providing security guarantees, as far as this Saudi Arabia, Iran is concerned. And don't forget also that these are major players as far as the Israel-Gaza conflict is concerned.
Yeah, in the Middle East.
And yeah, exactly. You realize that Iran is always supporting the Hamas, and then the Hezbollah, and then other factions that are supporting Palestine. And recently, Israel and Saudi Arabia are beginning to get closer.
Yes.
Okay, they're beginning to sign contracts. And all of a sudden, this conflict started and everything is put on hold and all that. And I think China can act maturely in, trying to speak truth to whoever is involved. If Israel is doing something wrong, China has the moral authority to speak right to Israel. And I think they have done that recently. by calling some of the Israeli hypocrisy out, by indicating to them that they are only focused about the civilian casualties in their countries, and they are not even focused on about the security, the civilian casualties in Gaza, and that is hypocrisy. And I was very impressed that Chinese ambassador to the UN also was able to say this, something that China would not have been able to say some years back. But they're beginning to get bold. I mean, they're beginning to talk, and some of these things also clarifies that this is the position of China. Okay, because China is a very influential, country, and as they begin to speak like this, people can begin to, see reason, not just emotions, in some of the things that are happening. So, if you look also at what the global security initiative that China is proposing is, involving or entailing, you can also see that it involves sovereignty, territorial integrity, non-intervention, and all those kind of things. And these are the things that are actually defining politics as we see it today. If you look at Russia-Ukraine, it is all about, sovereignty, territorial integrity. If you look at Gaza-Israel, you also realize the issue of sovereignty, territorial integrity, these are all fundamental to them. So if we pay a closer attention to what this GSI, the global security initiatives, are talking about, and we clearly define what country sovereignty is, whether they have the right to exist on their own and have territorial integrity. Nobody can just encroach on the borders anyhow. And we implement some of these things. I think that it will be good for global international security, better than what it is today.
All right. Here I would like to tell something to our audience that if you have any question, please write your question in a chat box. So later on we could, look at the questions and answer some of those. And this would be my last question. Then I would hand it over to my co-host, Ms. Rutt Syed, and she would be asking you questions. So my last question is about that. We have witnessed that when we were in China, that China's rise is, peaceful rise, China's peaceful rise, China's soft power, and China does not want to be, the superpower of international order. China wants to be, at the center stage, you may say, or among the great powers. And as time has passed, now China is coming out as, all guns blazing, you may say, sometimes the wolf warrior diplomacy during the COVID years. And now China has been confronting the statements that are coming from the United States. So if you look at China's this new approach or new foreign policy that is reshaping in China, do you think China is going to be a status quo power, or China would be a revisionist one?
Very interesting question. And I think I wonder how maybe the foreign minister of China would want to answer this question, because it's a clearly kind of confusing situation that China finds itself right now. In their mind, or based on what they have been saying all this while, they would want to be a status quo power where they play within the existing international order and take advantage of the weaknesses within. But we also realize that as they move further, as they develop, as they expand, they cannot always play within. They will have to create new rules.
You have to
help. Exactly, because it will get to a point where you cannot benefit anymore from the existing framework. So you have to create new frameworks. So China probably is at a crossroad right now. There's one part of them that is like, oh, let's maintain the international stability because already we are benefiting from it. There's another part that is saying that for us to achieve what we want to achieve, we cannot always play within the rules. So we have to, let's say, import some element of revisionism into our foreign policy framework. So I think that's where they find themselves in right now. It's at a crossroad. All this issue of China is not interested in this, China is not interested in that. I think we are beginning to question it gradually. Yeah. Yes.
I would say that your answer is so diplomatic right now. You're at the crossroads.
Exactly. That's how I see it. So they don't want to be so radical and so dramatic about it, but definitely it is going towards that area where China will feel that if we play within this system, it doesn't work. Let me give you an example also. Recently, with the issue of the microchip,
Yes.
when the US placed this kind of ban on Huawei and all that, all of a sudden China is beginning to produce their own, okay? And more or less trying to say to America, we don't care about you anymore. But they will not say it openly. They will just try to quietly innovate, so that they can abandon the existing, powers that be. However, at the back of their mind, they know that they cannot remain there for long because there are people who can take advantage of their presence in that system. So they would want to innovate a new system for themselves as time goes by. That's how they are, or that's how I see the foreign policy goals to be, where they are taking advantage of the weakness of the system, at the same time trying to innovate a new system that is going to be maximizing their potentials. Yeah.
Absolutely. And fascinating. Your answer was diplomatic, but at the same time, it was crisp. Now, I would hand it over to Ms. Rutt Syed, and she would be asking you some questions, and that are related to the technological order that is, incoming in international system. So, Ms.
Okay.
Rutt Syed, over to you, please.
Okay, so thank you so much, Dr. Asif and Dr. Bright, for such an engaging discussion. And so I will be continuing from now onwards. And simply, if I have to start with the questions that I have in my mind, I think that the first question that I will put is relatively very easy, and I would want to have just a simple definition of how do you think that how does China perceive the African continent? We have already discussed about the engagements that China has with the African countries and with the Central Asian republics and with the rest of the world, with the countries from the rest of the world. But what do you think that how, if we simply want to define that, how does China perceive the African continent?
Well, that's a very good question, I must say. However, I think the answer is not straightforward. It's not the answers. The Chinese perception of Africa is more nuanced. It's more complicated in a way. They see Africa as a place of opportunity. Okay, they see Africa as a place of sourcing resources for the industries. They see Africa also as a stepping stone to where they can be as a civilization. At the same time, they see China also as a partner in order to advance, mutual interest for the two, people. Let me put it that way. So it's a mixture of different things. Depends on the particular issue at stake. So if it is about economic development, China sees Africa as a place to get raw materials. And if it is about diplomatic engagement, China sees Africa to get more votes in support of its missions in the United Nations. In terms of maybe labor, the excess labor capacity that China has, they send some of their workforce to Africa to engage in some of these construction purposes that are mutually beneficial to the two. They are outsourcing their excess labor, and Africa is also benefiting from infrastructure development and all that. So it's a mixture of so many, perceptions mixed into one. In terms of, let's say, social engagement, or let's say people-to-people engagement, I think there's more to do with that. And the reason is that China and Africa have not been, closely mixed together for a long time like it is today. So there is a lot of misunderstanding between Chinese and Africans, where some Chinese have some perceptions of Africans. And I must also tell you that Africans also have equally similar perceptions of Chinese. So it's more or less of mutual misunderstanding than, let's say, government policy. And I think with time, the relationship between the people, the Chinese and Africans, are going to be taking a better shape. Right now, it's at the formative stage where people are very suspicious of each other, and some are also very stereotypical. They stereotype people that, okay, these people are like this. And then the Chinese also, you know, there are some stereotypes. But I think it's just because it is now getting deeper than it used to be. All these people are beginning to understand each other and get to know each other. That's how I see it.
Okay, so thank you so much. I want to add also that for the time being, I think that the only best option for the African countries is China. We live in an era where we need the economic supremacy, or we need economic development. And as far as the case of the African countries is concerned, the only option they are left with for now is China, and China is willingly investing in African countries, whether that is concerned with the infrastructure development or the technological development or whatsoever. So in that case, I think that African continent or the African countries do need China. But here, one more thing comes that, as you've also told, that the currently the loans that China is giving to the African countries are better than those loans which can be given by the international organizations. So in that case, can you please clarify on that, and how these loans can be better for the African countries? I'm just asking this question because when it comes, when we see the case of Kenya, for example, we see that Kenya is facing a lot of problems, and in those problems, about one of the major problem that Kenya has been facing is the loan that it has taken from China, and it's not able to repay China those loans, and it accounts almost 64% of the total amount. So what do you think that in this case, how the Chinese loans are better for the African countries?
All right, very important questions. I think your question centers on two key things. The first one is whether the loans that are coming from China are better for African countries than those that are coming from the multilateral institutions. And then the other thing that I will respond to also is whether China is the only option for Africa. So I'll take it from the last one, which is whether China is the only option for Africa. I think the best way to put it to be, China is a significant option for Africa. However, I would not say it is the only option for Africa, because as we engage with other countries in other continents, we are also mindful of engaging with ourselves. Don't forget, Africa is a country with 54 countries. I mean, it's a continent with 54 countries. And a lot of the time, we do not even engage with each other. We do not even trade with each other. I'll give you these statistics that in terms of intra-African trade, we do only about 10%. Okay. Meanwhile, China is trading with the rest of the world at a higher rate, around 70%. But within Africa, it's only about 10%. It means we are looking outside and not within. And that narrative is changing because of the African Continental Free Trade Area Agreement, which was recently signed. And I must also say that the headquarters of that is in my country, in Ghana, where we are trying to promote intra-regional trade and trade more among ourselves, and exchange ideas and technology and movement of goods and all that, which I think is a better option for us rather than China being the only option. So now the second part is, how better is the Chinese loans than that of the multilateral institutions? Let me give you this example. So I just imagine, for example, I'm a creditor, I have a lot of money. Just imagine, for example, I have some money, and then I want to loan to somebody, right? And I say, okay, if I loan you this money, you have to use it to let's say, build a house where you can talk about democracy. Okay. And then another person says, okay, I can loan you this money, but use it for what you want to use for. Right? So these are the two options. When the multilateral institutions, the IMF or the World Bank, when they loan money to African countries, most of the time, money, we don't really have anything to show for it. The money ends up in the hands of corrupt politicians who actually misuse the monies, okay? And even the purposes for which these monies have been contracted, they're not things that are of priority to us. So for example, as Ghana, as African countries, we need a lot of investment in businesses. We need a lot of improvement in infrastructure, roads, and then maybe agriculture. But we get a loan from the IMF that says that we need to expand our parliament house. That is not a priority, okay? But they say, oh, for us to develop, we need more injections of democracy. But democracy alone does not bring development. In order for development to take place, we need connectivity, we need infrastructural development, we need more technology in terms of agricultural side. So those are the things that African countries are now interested in. China says, okay, if you want roads, if you want, improvement in this and that, we can give you money for that. So they gave us the money and we do that. But the Western countries, they gave us conditions. This is how you must spend the money. And the interest rates are even higher. So at the end of the day, it's more or less like a burden for us to go and take loans from that. And a lot of the time also, our governments go to these international organizations, borrow money, and use it to pay salaries to workers. And that is not really a smart move. If you want to borrow money, use it for something that is productive, that can bring returns, that can even pay back the loan. But if you're borrowing money for consumption, I think it's not a good idea. And that is why the Chinese loans are better than the Western loans. The interest rates are lower. The concessional component are also more. At the same time, they don't give us conditions on how to spend the money. So we have value for money compared to what we get from the Western countries. And on top of that, while they give us the wrong prescriptions, they tend to blame us for not being able to manage our own resources. I mean, that is just more or less like insulting the people on top. And I think that is why I consider the Chinese ones better.
Okay, thank you so much. I think you explained it very well. It was a very good analysis on how Chinese loans are a better option for the African countries. My third question will be more related to the geoeconomics of Africa. For example, we know that the African continent is very significant when it geopolitically, geostrategically, and even geoeconomically, it's a very significant region. So, and we see that China is in the new tech world order that we see today. China is progressing. It has been competing with the great powers of the world. So in that case, can you please highlight that how the African countries are a resourceful area for the raw materials for the technological advancement that China could have in future?
Very important question. The continent is one of those, is the oldest continent and yet the youngest continent. It's also one of the most resource-rich continents. So for example, if you take a country like Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that country alone, just one country, they have more of their coltan, and I think lithium also, than the rest of the world, just one country. And I'm very, very sure that maybe your laptop, your phone that you use contains an element of coltan, which is coming from the Congo. You see, so it is a very important area for the world in terms of geo-economic or even geopolitical purposes. So China needs the resources in those countries in order to keep producing the machines that are actually sold in all the markets of the world. And in terms of petroleum product also, a lot of the Chinese import of petrol comes from Angola, Nigeria, and other parts of the world. So they need some of these resources. They are trying to diversify by even now increasing the amount of petroleum they get from Russia, but they will still need to keep the lines flowing from Africa. And at the same time, they will need that also from Central Asia. And I'm sure there are a lot of resources over there for Russia, for China as well. So in terms of natural resources, petroleum products, or mineral resources, China needs a lot from Africa. And as soon as Africa cuts off China, you realize that Chinese will not be able to produce the quantities of the materials they're able to produce to feed the world. It's the same way with other parts of the world, Central Asia as well. Now, you also talk about the geopolitical significance of Africa. I think one of the things that I want to mention here is that if you look at the role that China is playing right now, I think it's on the whole a positive one. Let me give you an example. So if you look at the new members of the BRICS, you would also see 2 African countries. You would see Egypt. You would also see Ethiopia. And in Africa today, these 2 countries are more or less up in arms against themselves. They are trying to fight themselves over the Renaissance Dam, which Ethiopia is building to cut, of water to Egypt. But once they are all the same organization right now, they can talk some of these things over. So even in terms of geopolitics within the continent, Chinese influence is also, coming on board that. And it's probably the same thing that we can also say about Iran and Saudi Arabia, because they are also new members of what do you call it, the BRICS. And they are also more or less, there are tensions over there. So there are positive, things we can exploit from the presence of China, on African continent as well as Asia.
Yes, very true, very true.
I don't know if I answered the question. Okay.
Yeah. Yes. This brings us towards the last question that I'll be asking from you, and then we'll go to the participants. We'll ask 2 to 3 questions from the participants as well. So
Okay.
bringing on to the last question, I would just like to have your comment on the future of the chip industry. As we see that chip industry is a very nascent strategic industry that has emerged, and China has been progressing in it. It has been advancing in this industry. So, what do you think that what future prospects does this country hold for China, and how it can compete with the rest of the great powers of the world?
Very important. It's one of the key areas that China is doing very well in. And I must say that I think this year alone, they have budgeted about $15 billion into the development of, AI and other related technologies. So they are really focusing on and all that. But let me first of all talk about the chip industry that you mentioned. You remember also the conflict with or the struggle with America over Huawei, in recent times, where, during, I think, Donald Trump, there was a sanction on China over, sanction on Huawei in terms of some chips and all that. Today, what do we see?
Sorry,
Huawei has come out with a new...
Let me just jump in and just add one point.
Okay.
The Huawei was basically the provider of 5G technology in England and other European countries. But the West do not want China's 5G because they think the devices they are placing, they have a backdoor access to, sensitive information, or they can hack and get into their system. And at the same time, China was becoming self-sufficient in terms of the latest technology, you may say.
So that's a very important, significant intervention here. So we're talking about 5G. For me, I also want to add AI to it. So we're talking about 5G technology. We're talking about microchip industry. We're talking about AI. I think those are very important considerations for any state that wants to be on top of the globe, I mean, in the years to come, especially AI. And China has been doing quite well in that. And the more the Western countries fight China, the more China becomes innovative in navigating around their sanctions and all that. So with the issue of the 5G sanction on Huawei and all that, what do we see today? Huawei is now innovating. They have a new, I think the latest phone that they adored, there's a name for that. It has a chip component that is not made in Taiwan, okay? However they did that, it's an amazement to the Western countries. They don't really understand how China was able to do that in 4 or 5 years. I mean, so I think that the battle is going to be bigger going forward. It will slow down China's development, but certainly it will not completely stop it, because I think the Western countries are too late in terms of crippling China. There isn't much they can do now to stop China from developing the chips, the 5G technology, the AI tools and all that. They can only reduce the pace at which they can develop it, but definitely they can never truncate it completely. They can never stop it completely. It's something that China would have to navigate its way around in order to do it. And as China makes strides in advancing its AI technology, 5G technology, and this microchip industry, you realize that it will now become easier for them to just control everything, really. And that is why the Chinese government has been investing a lot of money into these industries. Like I was saying, they invested about 15 billion just this year, which is more than what they invested in the years past. That shows how serious they are with these industries and how they want to, be on top of the world as far as these industries are concerned.
Yes,
So that's how I
we
see
do.
it.
We do see that China is very serious when it comes to its chip industry and the advancement in this industry. And so thank you so much, Dr. Bright. Now I'll be asking you for some of the questions from our participants. The first question, actually the compilation of the 2 questions that I see in front of me. It is basically, the participant has asked that how we see that the African Union is including itself into the G20. So how does this counterbalance the effect of China's influence on Africa? And simply, if I want to compile the other question also, it says that how does the African countries can keep the East and West balance when it comes to the Chinese investments? So these are the 2 questions that.
All right, so I'll take it from the first one, the issue of Africa now having a seat in the G20. So how do we call it now, G21? Or G20 plus Africa? Interesting. But for me, to be very frank with you, I think this is not the key thing. The key thing that Africa needs is a seat at the UN Security Council. Because the G20
very good point.
Is just a fanciful idea, or they don't really have a much biting power. If they're serious about including Africa into this kind of multilateral engagement, the place has to be the UN Security Council, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, because that's where the key decisions, that's where the veto powers are, that's where the centers of global politics takes place. So for me, I'm not so much enthused about Africa being made a member of the G20. I think it's just nominal. It is not real. It is just something to, tickle us so we can laugh. But in terms of real power play, it does not inure to any benefit to us as far as you're concerned. So I don't think it in any way counterbalances anything. If there's a need for counterbalancing, then let's move the seat away from the G20. Let's push it into the UN Security Council. Yes, and make Africa, or the African Union, a permanent member, not one of the 10 rotational members, but a permanent member with a voting right, with a veto power. Then we are serious about including Africa into global, political centers. So that's how I see it. I think the G20 is not as important as the UN Security Council. Yeah.
Okay, thank
And
you
then
so
I
much.
think there was a second question, if you could repeat it again.
The second question about the East and West balance. Yeah, so that I think that it's very appropriate to say that the African countries do need a place in the world now, because of their relevance, because of their strategic importance and strategic significance. The next question, which I think I assume is the last question that we have, is a very relevant one, and I think it is we missed out this in our discussion. This question is that we see that both India and China are using their currency, they are promoting their currency, they are doing trade in their currency, and both are investing in the continent of Africa. So, in the African region. So, in the contemporary order, how do you see the role of these rising powers, coupled with the engagements that they are having, especially in the context of globalization, deglobalization, and the concept that the rebranding of the globalization, the concept of globalization?
Well, this is a very important question as well. The de-dollarization, I think I'll put it under the issue, the broader concept of de-dollarization, because most of the time, as you engage in international trade, you will need to use an international reserve currency, which is a US dollar. But increasingly, there is that growing, interest in creating an alternative. And so you realize that some countries have already started. China and Russia, they have already started, they are buying the Russian gas and all that in Chinese yuan. And I think that India also recently started that. They'll buy arms from Russia using the rupees. So it's a very interesting development as far as the Africans perceive it. We think that the US dollar has not been very positive for many African countries. Because look, let me give you an example of my country. In 2 years, my currency, or Ghanaian currency, has depreciated so much against the US dollar. And meanwhile, all that they do is to print their currency. And we have to work so hard to buy the currency. They have to issue the instruction to the printer will print it $100, and we have to work so hard to earn the $100. And so in 2 years, like in 2 years ago, 1 US dollar was equivalent to 6 Ghana cedis. Today it's about 12. So you need $1, you get only 12. You need 12 Ghana cedis to get only $1, so 2 times. Okay. And that is very, very bad, because while we are working so hard in order to earn the international currency to buy and trade with other countries like China, USA only has to print it. It doesn't look fair. It doesn't sound fair at all. So if countries are coming forward and say, okay, India comes, or I want to trade with you, Ghana, I want to buy your oil, I want to buy your gold, I want to buy your cocoa, but I'll pay you with rupees. Okay, we also want some supplies from India. We want to buy maybe the Indian Tata bus, or what again do they have? Maybe pharmaceutical products. Then we also pay them in Ghana cedis. Then we forget about the US dollar. At the end of the day, it is punishing US indirectly, but better for us as a country. So the more we engage in this, the better. But however, I think it is not going to be so straightforward, because more currencies create more instability, more uncertainty, and more unpredictability. So it is going to be a more chaotic situation for most countries that are engaged in this kind of trade, because especially when countries are not creating value to back their currencies, then they also just go to the printer and print their currencies to buy from India. There's no value created to balance the currency. At the end of the day, it is going to create chaos. So we have to be very careful about this. On the one hand, it is good. On the other hand, if it is not properly managed, if the currencies are not backed by values, or maybe by gold standard or anything, then at the end of the day, we are actually collapsing it. So that's how I see it. We have to be very careful. It's a good thing, but we have to be careful how we do it. If not, at the end of the day, we might completely collapse the international monetary system and global trade.
Yeah, let me add one point to this question as well. And the thing is, if you look at the China and India as well, both of these countries are the benefitors of the current economic liberal order. They have benefited immensely from this economic order. However, and at this moment, both of these countries do not have the clout to, you may say, challenge or to give something to this economic order. They are the only benefiters. Even if they are going to trade in their own economy, it's some sort of, you may say, just to show resistance against the United States that, yes, we can do that. But if you look at the larger perspective, it's not hurting the United States. It is hurting the international order somewhat.
Yeah.
China, on the other hand, if you look at China as a revisionist superpower in the future, China must have to, have something on the plate that can replace this existing liberal order. So that's how I see it. Yes, if you look at, the global South and the countries, the developing world specifically, our own economies have infrastructural problems. The structural problems exist within our economies that lead to, the depreciation of our domestic currencies. And at the same time, right now, especially after the COVID, we've seen that even right now, Chinese economies have hurt because of the COVID. And at the same time, it has slowed down. China and India, both in this region, have engaged within each other, and their bilateral trade is around $100 billion. Why don't they do their trade between each other in their local currencies?
That's a question. And to even cut to before you finish, that $100 billion, America only prints it.
Yes.
And they have to work to get it in order to
Absolutely.
trade.
They can print it out and
Yes.
give it to, they can, give their debt, if you look at it in that terms.
Exactly.
Anyways, yeah, it's a very interesting conversation, and I'd like to have it continue, but we are running out of time. I appreciate you spared some time for us, and thank you so much for everybody who participated in this engaging conversation, and thank you for the questions. We try to answer most of the questions, but we are limited on time. And Dr. Bright, it's always a pleasure to have you, and it's fascinating, and it reminds me of our time and our conversations that we used to have
exactly
in China. And I hope to see you soon, inshallah, in person. In person. Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for sparing your time. And good luck. Have a good evening, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much. All the best.
All right.
Okay.